Okay, so just to quickly, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about Part 107. I figure you guys probably know a lot about it, so I'm not going to really focus on what we have with Part 107 right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming up, what's in line from the FAA, and then I want to talk a little bit about opportunities to get involved, I guess I would say. And with sort of the overall message I want you to think about is when people talk about the UAS industry, I mean, what do they mean by that? And I would say, look around. This is the UAS industry. Like, you guys are out there doing really cool stuff with these products, right? If you want to keep doing cool stuff, you need to get involved and help with regulation and standards and keep pushing this forward. So, just a little bit about Part 107. So what we had before was called these 333 exemptions. It was literally you petitioning the government to be exempt from federal regulation. So when you think about that, that's kind of mind-blowing. Like, not an easy thing to do. You know, people hired lawyers. It locked you into this long process that people typically put in their petition. You didn't hear back for 6 months. You can't plan a business around that. And then once you got your conditions, you're really locked into that. So if something changed, like, wow, in the last year since I got my petition through, I actually am using a new piece of technology. Instead of some old drone, now I'm using the M100. If that's not on your petition, you can't use the M100. So it was like being sort of in a box. You're kind of stuck there with what you ended up with. And I would call Part 107 is more like you get your driver's license and then you're sort of set out on the road. So follow the rules of the road, and then it's kind of up to you as long as you're following the rules. There's a much clearer process for how you get that certificate to start out. So how many people here actually have a remote pilot certificate? So I've got one. It's pretty clear. 87% of the people who take that test pass it first time. And once you have that, you're free to go out and fly as long as you follow the rules of the road. You should stay under 400 feet AGL. You stay in visual line of sight. You stay in Class G airspace. It's just a completely different environment to operate in. So I think this is a really important milestone for the FAA and for the industry that lets us actually start operating in a way where you can actually plan your business, you can plan how you're going to fly, you can make schedules, completely different than before. I'd mention up there also, I mean, the Part 333s, you had to have a pilot's license, and now you don't. When you think about all the work involved in getting a pilot's license, and then how much of that might be actually applicable to flying something around visual line of sight, it didn't really make a lot of sense. So looking a little deeper at this, one of the big issues that we face now I can follow the rules of the road. I can fly where I want to, but a lot of the places where I want to fly aren't Class G airspace, so I can't necessarily fly where I want to. So the FAA is setting up a system to get authorization to fly in airspace that is not Class G. This is a little bit different than, say, hobbyists who have to notify when you're flying near an airport. It's a little bit different than before where there were like radiuses around airports. Now you don't have to worry about if that grass strip out there is still an airport. Do I have to stay 5 miles from it? Like, if it's in Class G, I can fly there. That's all I have to worry about. But if it's not in Class G, how do I get the authorization to fly? The FAA has, interestingly, perhaps, decided that the way they're going to issue authorizations is through a website. So you can't actually get on the radio and talk to the tower and ask for authorization. Officially, their tower's not supposed to do that. You're supposed to go through this website, which probably a bunch of you have been there. You can enter, when you're going to fly, how high you're going to fly. You have to set a center point. You have to set a radius. And then you kind of hit send, and it goes off into the internet. And hopefully they give you an email eventually saying, yes, we received your request. We're thinking about it. So, and you read the details. They want you to give 90 days ahead of time. Expect maybe it'll take 90 days to get your authorization. So this is kind of a big bummer. You can't. We're sort of back to the 333s in a way where you can't really plan things. If I'm a real estate photographer and someone says, hey, I'm selling this house next week, can you come out here and fly? And I look, and I'm like, oh, it's Class D. Hey, can you wait 3 months and then I can come fly and take pictures of the house you're trying to sell? That doesn't really work. But here's what the FAA is thinking behind this. So they've actually asked, every piece of this controlled airspace, there's someone who's controlling it. So they've asked all the people who control these things to look at charts, and they've divided them into grids, and they've said, what do you really care about? If a guy was flying a drone at 200 feet, 100 feet, 400 feet, would you actually care if he was there? So if you imagine an airport here, let's say the runway is this way, someone flying right here at 200 feet, right next to the runway, they're probably going to care. Someone flying over here, it's probably not a big deal. There's probably, there's buildings and things. If I'm filming a house and it happens to be over there, there shouldn't be a plane flying there anyway. So the FAA is trying to work on making an automated system so that when you plug in all these things and send it off, hopefully eventually it goes to a database, and it should quickly flag either yes, you're approved, or someone should look at this closer, or just no. And the way you can help yourself when you're interacting with this system eventually is sort of being smart about how you enter this data. So don't always ask for 400 feet if you don't need it, because they're planning on having sort of sloped airspace. So out here, maybe they'll tolerate 400 feet, but here close in, they only want to tolerate 50 feet. So if the job you're doing only requires 100 feet, just put 100 feet, what you actually need. And because the system is kind of weird, how it has to have a radius and a center point, think about, where do I really need to operate? And I may not be operating at the center point of that. So I may be sitting on the edge of a field here, and I really want to operate over here. So maybe I declare my center point here and the radius from that. So you're getting sort of the minimum amount of airspace that you need to actually do the job. So it's pretty cumbersome right now. And I've seen, on social media and things, a lot of people complaining about this. I totally understand and agree, but hopefully this is a situation that's going to change over time. The FAA realizes it's not really, right now, a tenable situation. But hopefully it'll improve. So the other really interesting thing, I think, about Part 107 is they understood that this is really just a starting point. So they built into it the idea that each of the requirements, that's an operational limitation, they built in the idea that you could request a waiver from it. And it's a much simpler process than before with the petitions, because it's actually, in the law, it's possible to get a waiver. You're not getting an exemption from the law. The law allows you to get a waiver. So everything that, every limitation that's in there, you can think about, it says I can only fly during the daytime, I want to fly at night. I have a FLIR camera, I want to fly at night and see the heat leaking from the top of my building. So you can look up the requirements for daylight operation. And the interesting thing is that the FAA tells you exactly what they want to see when you ask for this waiver. So they're already giving you requirements. They call these performance-based standards for the waivers. There's a link to a PDF. And so you can just go through and say point by point to get a waiver for daylight operation, there's 5 things they want you to address. So you write up something explaining how you're going to address each of those 5 points, send it in with your request for a waiver, and hopefully at some point you get a waiver, and they can last up to 4 years. There you can also see a list of all the waivers that have been granted. So you can look at what other people have been doing. You scratch your head, I'm like, I don't know how to do point 2. You can go look at what other people's waivers have been granted. You can see the conditions the FAA has put on them. So it really helps you get flying in these situations. And so I would say as a business, think about every type of operation you want to do. Start looking through this list of performance standards and think about how you might want to address these. And why not do it now? Put in a waiver request now. Figure out how if you want to fly at night sometime, put in a request now. Get that process going. It's good for 4 years. There's no real reason to wait. And there's an interesting list of what kind of waivers people have been granted. Most of them right now have been to allow people to fly at night, but there's also waivers granted to allow one pilot to control multiple vehicles at the same time, to fly from a moving vehicle in a non-rural area, I guess you would put it, to do some beyond visual line of sight stuff, and to do operations over people. So it's really a much more flexible system than we had before. And they're trying to make it easy for you to get these waivers, or at least to understand how to get these waivers. So I think that's a really important step forward that we have. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what's coming up. So that was Part 107. One of the things it doesn't allow you to do is it says you can't fly over people. There are many times you either want to fly over people because the people are the whole reason why you're there. There's a demonstration, there's a parade, you're flying for the news. There might be times when you might have to fly over people sort of incidentally. For example, I want to do infrastructure inspection on a street in a city. You can look outside in San Francisco. There's people flying or walking around the sidewalks. I may have to fly sort of across the street to get to the cell tower on top of the building across the street. There may be times you can't necessarily guarantee that you're not flying over people. So the street would be an example of that. Maybe you're working a construction site and you don't want to close the construction site just so you can do your Bentley context capturing. So this is, I think, a really important piece of the next part of the puzzle. So in March, the FAA convened what they call an ARC, an advisory, now I'm forgetting what ARC stands for, basically an advisory committee. They called the micro ARC, to look at this question of what kind of rules could we make to allow operators to fly over people. I actually was representing DJI on that ARC, along with Brendan Schulman, our VP of Policy. I spent 3 weeks in Washington talking to people, learning about things. The ARC is a big collection of stakeholders. So there's people from airport operations, there's helicopter pilots, there's commercial pilots, there's General Aviation Manufacturers Association, there's toy manufacturers, there's RC hobbyists, the AMA. Just really a big collection of all the people who might be somehow involved in this question. The conclusion of this was that there should be a way for operators to fly small UAS over people with an acceptable level of safety. And I think that's a key point in this. Nothing is ever 100% safe. To get here today, I took BART, and then I walked 6 blocks up here. And that was probably much riskier than if I took my Phantom 4 and flew it over my kid's soccer game. The ARC really focused on this issue that there is an element of risk in all of aviation. And UAS should be no different. We shouldn't be held to a different standard. So there should be a way to fly over people. And the recommendation centered around a few ideas. One was that if a UAS actually falls and hits someone, obviously a smaller thing like a Mavic is going to be less damaging than a larger thing like the Agris out there. There ought to be a way for us to set, the FAA is really into performance standards, so we'll say performance standard. There should be a performance standard that separates something that's sort of nominally safe enough so that if it falls and hits someone, it's not going to kill everyone it touches. And left it to the FAA to set that performance standard. But then to follow up, there should be an industry consensus standard that would tell you how to meet that performance standard. So basically some sort of drop test that would quantify how much damage this thing would do falling on you. So that's kind of the framework that was set up for this operations over people. NPRM stands for Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. We expect that the FAA will issue this NPRM anytime, which could mean tomorrow, it could mean 2 months from now. The way the government works, it's hard to schedule. But once this NPRM comes out, what that is that they've taken the recommendations from the ARC, they put it through the meat grinder, and out comes the sausage. And now here's one of these opportunities to get involved that I was talking about. One thing that the FAA does is when you have an NPRM, they open it up for comment, and we need everyone to comment. Anyone who's interested in doing this, whether you think, no, that's way too dangerous, you should never let these things fly over people, or you think, hey, your restriction that you're putting on here, I think prevents me from accomplishing the work I want to accomplish, and I think the work I want to accomplish could be done safely with AVC. The FAA needs this kind of input because basically the people writing the rules are all in Washington, D.C., in that building, the FAA building, and they're not the ones out there flying things. They don't have the experience that you have. And they may put unrealistic expectations of what is a reasonable operational limitation. It could just be, hey, I can't fly that way. So they need that input from all of us. The key point here is that if you can actually go look at when they issued Part 107, the rules themselves are maybe 6 pages, 10 pages, I don't know. But when they issued it, there's about a 150-page document that came out with it. And that's where they went through point by point for all the paragraphs of every rule they made. They talk about all the comments that came in and why they agree with it or disagree with it and how they resolve these conflicts to end up with the rule they end up with. So this is actually real input and is valuable input, and it really helps us as an industry to have some push to get the regulations going the way we want. So first opportunity to join in, I would encourage everyone to look into how do you become aware when the NPRM comes out and to comment when it does. The point is to kind of think about how they're planning to change the rules, how they're planning to expand possible operations, and think about the kind of work you do and where that fits. Maybe Part 107 by itself is perfect for you. You don't need anything else. That's cool. Maybe, though, you want to do pipeline inspection or power line inspection, and visual line of sight is really not a really good limitation for that when you're trying to inspect 50 miles of pipe. So at some point, they're planning to expand rules so that beyond visual line of sight will be an allowed operation under certain conditions. And I'm sure they'll have a performance standard that'll list all the things you need to do to be able to fly like that. This is sort of another point to start thinking about how you can get engaged, is you can help decide what those performance standards could be. You can help decide what those limitations can be. So really the message here is to sort of, don't treat the FAA as an enemy. Don't treat the FAA as something that's way on the other coast. And we don't have to think about, as a company, as your company, have some time where you're thinking about the FAA. Have some time when you're thinking about having, make someone responsible for checking up on, what are the current regulations? What are the next proposed regulations? Because these will affect your business. And when they affect your business, they can affect your technology roadmap. They can affect, how you plan to deploy things, or what's really realistic in terms of how you're going to make money next year. This is different, I think, from maybe Uber or Airbnb, where they just sort of, hey, we deploy an app and people start using it, and who knows if it's legal or not, like whatever, right? This is things flying around in the air. The government takes that a lot more seriously than whether or not you are paying someone to get a ride with them. So this is just sort of another look at that roadmap of the FAA is planning based on kind of technology. And again, I'm not going to go through all the details, but really the idea, again, is to think about what you're doing and the technology you guys are developing, and how does it fit into this roadmap, and when should you start thinking about, becoming engaged with the FAA. So I'm going to change topics a little bit now, completely away from Part 107, but still related to the FAA. There's a thing called the DAC, the Drone Advisory Council. Hopefully you guys have heard of it. The FAA is asking, has asked for industry stakeholders to come together and give advice about what priorities stakeholders see the FAA should be working on. Again, DJI is very involved in this. We have Brendan Schulman, our VP of Policy, sitting on the DAC. One of the priorities he was trying to push for is this idea of preemption in the question of whether state and local laws should have precedence over federal law when it comes to flying drones. The FAA itself has been, I don't know if I'd say vague, but sort of a little bit wishy-washy on this. The FAA is basically saying, look, yes, we control the airspace in terms of safety. And the FAA is responsible for keeping all the airspace safe. But that said, there are valid local concerns people might have about privacy or security. And so we're going to let localities make rules in certain areas. We're not really going to fight it. So the question becomes, as someone flying for business, do I have 50 US states and 100 different cities that I have to deal with when I fly? If I'm here in San Francisco and then I go over to Nevada, am I going to break the law inadvertently and end up with a fine or in jail for doing this thing that I would do normally in San Francisco? Or are we going to have sort of one United States, and if I'm here in San Francisco flying, I can go to Kansas and fly there too? This is really a big open legal area. We, DJI and others we work with, we're tracking something like 250 local state laws and city laws. And so we're actually going and testifying in front of state legislators. We're talking to lawmakers. We're talking to cities. We're trying to write model legislation. And I think our stance is, we don't want a law that just says, screw you guys, you have to listen to FAA or something. We want to have just consistent, reasonable legislation so that people can get the value out of this technology that's really there. So this is perhaps another opportunity to get involved. We are right now lobbying tons of places. We'd love if other people were doing that as well. So if this kind of thing interests you, you can contact me, us. I'd pass you over to our policy team. But we would love to have more people working on this. So this kind of leads into the question, why are these people interested in making all these laws? So, if I fly into SFO from Kansas, there's not all the cities in between regulating what that 747 is doing on the way over here. So why are all these states, why do they feel like they need to have drone rules? And why do the cities want to have drone rules? And I think a lot of these are basically being proposed out of fear. So, us, the industry, we have all these cool applications we want to do. And we're talking to regulators, hey, we want to, we want to fly over factories. We want to fly in vineyards. We have tons of cool stuff we want to do. It's going to bring so much value to this country. We're creating jobs. We're saving lives, right? And the regulator is kind of balancing all this new stuff we want to do with the other people using the airspace and people on the ground. And I kind of feel like as an industry, we have this part pretty well covered. I mean, we are pretty good at promoting ourselves. We're pretty good at working out things with the other stakeholders. Again, DJI is working really hard on this. We have people, we have industry groups we work with. We have the DAC. We have these ARCs. We have cordial relationships with pilots groups, with airport operators. We want to work together to make a safe system. And I think probably everyone does, right? That's how you make a strong industry, is by having, especially for aviation, is having a safe industry. People have a much lower tolerance for aviation accidents than they do for car accidents, for example. But what I think is going on is that people are seeing, ISIS is using drones to fly in Syria, and they've put bombs in some of the drones. We have people shooting down their neighbor's drone with shotguns because they think their neighbor is spying on them. I don't know if you guys have seen that video someone made of looking out the window of an airplane, and a drone comes by and hits the wingtip and knocks the wingtip off. It was a fake video, but people believed it was real. I actually was at a presentation by a California state agency where they showed this as like, hey, drones are hitting airplanes. There was this other fake video that someone did in South Africa, I believe, where they said the drone flew through their office window and hit him in the head. And again, it's fake, but people believe it, right? I mean, these are the kind of things people worry about. And when I say fear, I mean, I don't mean this is baseless. I'm not trying to denigrate or discount the fact that these are real worries. The way you fight this, I think, is not by saying those worries don't exist. The way you fight this is by showing people what a drone is, showing what value you get out of it. So I think what we can do to fight this and make a better industry for all of us is we have to kind of take the bulls by the horn. We have to engage, we have to do outreach, we have to be good neighbors. And by engage, I mean, as you're part of your business, do you know who your state senators are? Do you know who your state assembly person is? Have you ever talked to them? Do you know who your federal senators are? Do you know who your congresspeople are? Have you ever talked to them? Because lawmakers, if they don't hear from us, they're going to be hearing from those groups that think ISIS is here flying drones into their buildings. They're going to be hearing from people who are worried about, the awesome cameras we have spying into their bathroom while they're showering. So we want those lawmakers to hear from us. And we want them to hear, hey, I'm a startup. I'm planning to, hire 10 people in your district. And hopefully 5 years from now, we'll have 20 people. Tell them the good things the industry is doing. Tell them the value. Tell them how we're saving lives. Tell them how we're helping fire and police departments. Tell them how we're going to make buildings more energy efficient by doing surveys of heat leaking through the roofs. Give them something to work with. Make it easier for the lawmakers to, when someone else comes in and complains about a drone, the lawmaker, at least the staff member, has a basis for why these things are even there. It's something to fight that fear. And I think even one step farther is, look at the community around you. When you fly things, hey, that's an opportunity to talk to people. That's an opportunity to talk to people about all the good things you're doing the same way. I explain to them, these are being done for business. This is actually a real application. This is saving lives. This is helping police and fire. I have people in my neighborhood who think that thieves are using drones to follow UPS trucks to steal packages. When they see a drone, that's what they think of. They don't think, oh, maybe the neighbor's getting ready to sell his house, or hey, the neighbor wants to put an addition and is wants to have some mock-ups of what it's going to look like when they add a room. So not only engage lawmakers, engage people around you. We're doing really cool things. Like, let everyone know. I think that needs to be sort of part of being a business in this industry as well. Finally, there's something, the NTIA has published, what do they call them? These guidelines for neighborly drone use. So that's sort of the colloquial version. It's actually a longer document that's more legalese. But at the end of it, they kind of condense it to these guidelines for neighborly drone use. And I think that's something to look at, think about. It basically says, talk to people. If you have to fly over someone else's property, if you can, tell them what you're going to do. If they strenuously object and you don't have to fly over their property, don't fly over their property. If you're collecting data that might be sensitive, like you're flying over people's homes and crowds and things like this, and you're, think about Google driving around and they're worried about people and they had to blur them. And if you're flying and collecting sensitive data, think about how are you going to protect that data? Do I really need that data? And so these are kind of the guidelines for this neighborly drone use. They're guidelines, they're not rules, they're not laws. But I think this, again, sort of helps us show people that as an industry, we're not callous to their concerns. We understand Everyone's concerned about big data and privacy, and we should be too. And when we need to take data like that, we'll protect it. If we don't need the data, we won't take it. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at if you haven't seen that. Finally, I'm the director of technical standards. What that means is I work with all these standards bodies. And this is the backbone of the aviation industry. We want the FAA to tell us sort of what needs to be done in terms of these performance standards. You know, what do we have to do to make things safe? But we don't necessarily want them to tell us how. We want them to say, you know, you shall have some system that keeps you from hitting a building when you're flying at less than 50 miles an hour. Perfect. Let us figure out how to do that. And then as an industry, let's make a standard so that anyone can just follow A, B, C of that standard and hand over to the FAA, yep, I've complied with your regulation. So that allows us as an industry to innovate, to change technology, to improve things. It doesn't lock you into a certain design or a certain bit of technology. I mean, you think about you know, what we had a few years ago versus what we have now. The change is incredible. And you think about when you fly in an airplane, the last time I flew to Asia, I was in a 747-400. That's like a 30-year-old design. And they're flying it today, safe, you know, why not? But, you know, think about that in terms of the UAS industry today. There was nothing 30 years ago that is comparable to anything we're doing now. And again, I know it doesn't sound sexy and cool, but like these standards things, there's a lot going on there. And if you're not writing the standards, then someone else is. And the someone else who's writing them are people who don't do what we do. ASTM, for example, I'm leading a working group to write a standard to address the operations over people. So when the NPRM comes out, we're going to go into high gear and make an industry standard so that you can comply with that rule. And hopefully by the time the rule is actually published and in power, we'll have a way for you to comply with that rule. RTCA is a big organization, very traditional in aviation. ISO is doing a bunch of stuff in this now. CTA has been very involved in both some standards work, but also a bunch of the lobbying that I talked about earlier. And if you guys do any work in Europe, Eurokai is now revamping all of their UAS standards. So this is also a great way to get involved.